As I bring in Sushant Sareen into this conversation, Ambassador Veena Sikri joins us in a moment. Burzeen stays with us, as does Geeta. Sushant Sareen, the West, or at least a section there, believe that there is no one except perhaps China and Iran that want to remain engaged with the Russian president. But is that actually the case?
No, that's not the case, Gaurav. Quite clearly, there are many countries that remain engaged with Russia. Now, it's partly the Western Bloc and their arrogance and their hypocrisy and their domination over the international discourse, which makes everybody imagine that, the rest of the world has cut off relations with Russia, but that's not the case. Yeah, for God's sakes, even the Europeans are buying Russian energy. How
Even if
is
it's directly and through India.
No, and look, the point is, how is it that when they buy Russian energy, that does not fuel the war, but when Indian buys Russian oil, which bulk of it processes and sells it back to the Europeans, that is what fuels the war. I can't understand this logic, and none of these Western journalists and academics and all these fellows, none of them bother to explain how this mathematics works.
Okay. Burzeen, you want to come in? You want to come in on that? You want to come in on that for a moment, because India finds it very strange that Scott Bessent, US Treasury Secretary, would want to impose additional tariffs on India for using Russian oil, but not on that same Russian oil that's then refined and exported to Europe and other countries.
You will remember in the last few months of the Biden administration, I forget her name, there was a Commerce Department official who had come to New Delhi on a working visit. And when she was questioned, she did say that the finished lubricants and petroleum products that India exports to the EU and elsewhere are not Russian oil anymore, strictly speaking. So I don't know why we are flogging this dead horse, because
that's a dead horse. And the LNG that's exported directly from Russia to Europe, that's a dead horse too?
No, that is not being done anymore. That is whittled down completely, practically whittled down. You can call out hypocrisy on the part of the West. You can call out hypocrisy on part of the West for finished lubricants that they may purchase from New Delhi. That's true. And incidentally, Prime Minister Modi also, during that same occasion, in the last months of the Biden administration, if I recollect correctly, and I do, had asked Indian suppliers to put a cap on these exports to the West, because obviously it was causing some embarrassment to him with the Biden administration. Now, the point is this. You have the oil coming in from Russia, but there is a precedent where India has discontinued purchases from Iran when it did after signing the 2005 Indo-US nuclear agreement. And India has an excellent relationship, and its primary supplier hitherto was always Iraq. So I don't know why India is not picking up the slack again with Iraq when it used to do so. And I mean, let's face it, geostrategically speaking, Iraq was the only Arab and Muslim state that consistently supported India on the OIC
Except that there
question.
were, and I will get Ambassador Veena Sikri to weigh in on this, there were sanctions that were imposed on Iran, and there are no sanctions on the Russian oil. There is just a price cap. Ambassador Sikri...
The sanctions on Iran were imposed in December 2006. I'm talking about President Bush's visit in 2005, when the first Indo-US nuclear 1-3 agreement talks were kick-started. It's from that time there was subtle pressure put on New Delhi to wean away from Tehran's oil. Initially it resisted, but by and by the Indians came around to it. And then the Indians also stopped purchases from Venezuela, if you recollect.
Again,
so India has behind the scenes
reason Ambassador Veena Sikri was very different, and in this case, when there is a threat of imposition of additional sanctions, a proud civilizational state does not buckle under pressure, especially when there are blatant double standards that come in from the West. I would presume, considering America still buys uranium hexafluoride from Russia, as it does palladium, chemicals and fertilizers. Ambassador Sikri.
Yes, well, I think first of all, I don't know why we're talking about something about Iran and Iraq. What about the oil that China is purchasing from Russia? The quantities of Chinese oil purchased from Russia are far more than Indian oil purchased from Russia. And China has got a 90-day pass on the tariff, a second 90-day pass on the tariffs. And India is has got a 25% additional tariff and prospects of even more tariffs being introduced if the talks don't go well. So this kind of double standards is not endearing the people of India to having a long-term trade relationship and a relationship with the US. I think this is the problem. The problem of double standards breaks down the trust factor.
Yes.
And the trust factor is vital in any relationship between any two countries or even in trade. So, why should the Indian pharma companies depend on their markets in the USA? They should look for other markets, and similarly for other goods. So I think this is the biggest problem in this thing. And there's not a word of the large amounts of oil that China continues to purchase from Russia and having no impact at all. I think we are looking at the output of the Trump-Putin summit. I think we all hope that it goes well and it leads to a further meeting with probably Zelenskyy being present. I think that President Trump has talked about a 25% chance of failure. That means 75% chance of success, which is not bad at all. And also the fact that he has recognized at very high stakes. I do think there will be some kind of a deal coming out of the talks in Alaska. They are talking about these two provinces, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, being given back, and then President Putin being allowed to keep the Donetsk and Luhansk areas
and Crimea and the road connection that President Putin so keenly is looking at. Sushant Sareen, before I come to you, Sandeep and Geeta Mohan, I want to, for the benefit of our viewers, just discuss what's at stake in this: a ceasefire. Now, that's something that Ukraine is very keen on. That's something that the United States is very keen on. And a ceasefire that may lead to additional concessions, security guarantees. Now, Ukraine and Europe, they're both very clear. There will be or should not be any territorial concessions that would let President Putin walk away as a victor from this engagement. There are conflicting accounts. There are many accounts that seem to indicate that on ground, he has been winning and winning handsomely, in control of 114,500 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory, a battlefront that's about 1,000 kilometers long, and he's gaining virtually every other day at a time when Ukraine is very short of manpower and other resources and weapons and systems. Ukraine's territorial integrity, because the apprehension is Ukraine today, it could be other parts of Europe in the months, years ahead. President Putin is also perhaps looking for an off-ramp for war. Why? So that the Russian economy may be revived. And apparently that's why that business delegation, and Geeta and Sandeep will tell us more about the business delegation of there's business-to-business talks. If sanctions are gradually lifted, there's forward movement of that. And of course, the global supply chain redrawn as a result of this conflict. President Putin will be arriving shortly, and there are reports that seem to indicate, and I will get Rohit Sharma to join us in a moment. Apparently, President Trump will walk up to his aircraft as President Putin comes down, and then there'll be a conversation there. And then the conversation, according to the Russians, could last several hours. Okay, there's more breaking that's coming in. Before I bring in Geeta Mohan and Sandeep, the Ukrainian president has just issued a statement ahead of these talks. He says, and I quote, "We are getting reports from the regions in Ukraine following the Russian strikes. Sumy, there's been a Russian strike on the central market in Sumy. In Dnipro region, strikes on cities and on enterprises. In Zaporizhzhia, in Kherson region, in the Donetsk region, Russia is deliberately striking territories even as it goes in for dialogue. The war continues," says President Zelenskyy. It continues precisely because there is no order nor any indication that Moscow is preparing to end this war. On the day of negotiations, they also kill people, and that says a lot. Sandeep, that's a very strong statement that comes in from President Zelenskyy. Sandeep.
Yes, absolutely, Gaurav. And while we don't know exactly what's going on with these strikes, we know that the fact is that President Trump has tried to reach out to President Putin on his own. He says that there is no pressure from Europe on him, and certainly no pressure from Ukraine on him. And that explains the choice of Alaska, which was actually, incidentally, former Imperial Russian territory until the late 19th century. It was sold to Russian Empire. It was sold to the US by the Russian Empire. Now, and not a lot of people know that the distance between Russia and the United States is it's less than 3 kilometers. That's how close these two countries really are across
At the northern tip. Yep.
I think President Trump has staked everything on it. He's tried very hard over the last 6 months to try and get President Putin to cease fire, to stop fighting, so that he can, get that big win that he's been wanting to. That would be the ultimate prize, Gaurav. And that's what's really at play here with Putin and Trump, this very, very important summit here in Alaska.
High stakes.
Trump wants that Nobel Prize for ending the bloodiest war of the 21st century.
Yes.
Until today. And
absolutely. A high stakes engagement that is all set to take place. Geeta, stakes perhaps highest for Ukraine, Russia, but clearly not low for President Trump, because as Sandeep rightly pointed out, it's about that Nobel Prize and about that claim that he made. 24 hours I get into White House, there will be a ceasefire. Had I been the president, this war would never have happened. 6 months plus, the war still rages even as we speak.
Well, yes, high stakes for President Trump in holding his image. He's been talking about how he's brokered many a ceasefire, but the first one that he'd claimed he would settle was Russia-Ukraine. And yes, this is the first time that the US president is meeting the Russian president. It is going to be a very important meeting. The first in-person meeting that's also in Alaska says a lot about how diplomacy between Russia and the United States of America is being conducted, Gaurav. But having said that, like the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov has said that the meeting will last about 6 to 7 hours. Trump has said that if within the first few moments he does not see things go forward, he could walk out. But the deal over here is not just of a ceasefire, like you said, and like Sandeep reiterated, it's beyond ceasefire. There is land, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, minerals, wealth. What is it that Putin has to offer Trump? They are no fools. They've done it for a very long time. They know the play here. They must have gamed it. They must have thought it through as to how they're going to go into this meeting with President
So before
Trump.
I bring in Burzin and and Sushant into this conversation, I want to quickly cut across to Anchorage, to Alaska. Rohit, my colleague, joins me for more from the United States of America. Rohit, bring us details of how this has all been planned. There are some reports that seem to indicate that President Trump will land, then he walks up to the aircraft of the Russian president and then escorts him. How does this work? What are details that you're picking up?
Well, the White House, Gaurav, has not said anything. I think the details that you're talking about have come from the Russian side. The White House has not released any such protocol where the President of the United States will walk up to the Russian president, as been reported by the Russian agency. So we have no confirmation as far as that. But what is definitely confirmed is that there's going to be one-on-one meeting with the Russian translator, with translators, I should say, where there would not be any other delegation in the room. It will be just one-on-one meeting with President Trump talking to Vladimir Putin, and then they will go to lunch with the delegation. Now, as he just said on Air Force One that he plans to walk away if he feels that Vladimir Putin is not interested in this. And what I've picked up from one of the people on Air Force One is that President Trump is very clear. He wants an assurance of ceasefire. He does not want partial ceasefire. He's going in asking the Russian president to announce a ceasefire as soon as he can. And then they could talk about swapping of territories and as such. So I think he's made it very clear that his intention in one-on-one meeting with Vladimir Putin is to go and ask for a ceasefire.
So ceasefire, but there is some talk about swapping territory. Burzin Wagmar, would that be seen as a defeat for Ukraine or fait accompli? There would have to be some territory that Ukraine will have to cede.
That will have to occur at some point, tragically enough. But yes, it is all very well to talk about Donetsk and Luhansk, the coal-producing regions that Putin covets, and which he can use as keystone elements for regrouping again in the future and attacking Ukraine, which is going to happen, make no mistake, in the near future. That is already on the decks. So Europe is prepared for that. But please understand, this must be underscored consistently. Putin is not after territory because simply they are Russian-speaking historic regions. He is hell-bent on this and this alone, namely erosion of Ukrainian statehood and the idea of Ukraine. And that idea, which he has never reconciled himself to since 1991, that Ukraine was always a part of Russia, never mind the other 14 republics which became independent states after 1991. And what is not going to be discussed at this summit, tragically enough, is the most sinister aspect of what's happened in the last 3 years: the kidnapping of 20,000 Ukrainian children, some as young as 4 months old, and who have been brainwashed into believing that they are Russians. So that is something which is going to be one of the most ignominious chapters when the history of this war will be written in times to come.
Okay, but one ceding territory, will it remain restricted to Donetsk and Luhansk in the Donbass region? Because now this battlefield has really moved forward to places like Kharkiv, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. Sushant Sareen, will Russia just walk back from this or say, now that I'm in control on 1/5 of this territory, what I have stays with me, that land route to Crimea stays with me? That's what the Russians are indicating, and that commitment that Ukraine will never join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Yeah, just a couple of things before I come to your main question. One, when Burzine talks about when the history of this conflict is written, it will depend upon who writes the history. And we know what kind of history is written by the Western world, especially by the British, and what kind of fakery is included in that kind of history. That is one. Not that others write any better history, but then we know that people write history according to what serves their purpose. Second, Burzine was utterly wrong when he says that the Europeans have cut down their gas purchases from Russia. In fact, their gas purchases from Russia have actually gone up last year.
Yes.
They haven't. They are planning to cut it down, but they still haven't.
66 billion euros last account. Go on, sir.
Putin believes that whatever money that the Europeans pay the Russians for gas does not contribute to war. Whatever oil India buys from Russia contributes to war. He's welcome to that belief. I don't know how she's come across that calculation. Third, and I think maybe I'm being a little optimistic. Gaurav, when you're on the verge of a ceasefire, just before that, the war actually starts picking up. If a ceasefire has to happen, the side which is probably slightly more dominant tries to grab as much space and as much territory as possible, because if ceasefire is going to then come about, because still nobody has decided on what is going to be the final deal,
yes,
which is worked out. What will be the land swaps that will take place? I doubt if the Russians are going to give more than a kind of a token of the territory that they have occupied. I would imagine they would want to keep the bulk of it. But for now, they would want to grab as much as possible, because then the front lines get frozen if there's a ceasefire. Now, the ceasefire need not necessarily be permanent. It can the fighting happen once again. But that will depend upon how the next stage of the negotiations proceed. And we don't know how that is going to happen, whether the Ukrainians, and I completely understand the Ukrainian reluctance to agreeing, ceding territory to Russia. It's entirely understandable from their point of view. But if there is going to be a kind of a temporary solution, a line of control kind of a solution, which we've seen in our part of the world, then you are asking for trouble, because then, this is a problem which is going to be festering all the time. And this is a problem which there will be external players. We've seen, for example, in our part of the world, how the Western come and, interfered in Jammu and Kashmir, not allowed a permanent settlement of that region. And the Brits in particular have played, all kinds of sinister games out here. We've seen that, right? So something similar could happen. And which is why the Russians are insisting that the areas which I have control over, I will annex, and you will all accept the annexation. Now, whether that happens or not,
absolutely. Absolutely, Ambassador Sikri, because that line of control kind of a situation, like we are suffering with a state sponsor of radical Islamist terror, Pakistan, would be very, very dangerous both for Russia and for Ukraine. And that's why President Putin's team's also been asking, who are we signing a deal with? Who's the legitimate authority in Ukraine? After the end of his tenure, does President Zelenskyy remain that legitimate authority?
Oh, yes, certainly. That is a big question of doubt because President Zelenskyy has refused to have elections in Ukraine, although his term has substantially finished a long time back. And I think I would also like to remind your panelists from London about the history of Ukraine after 2014,
Yes.
and how the agreements that were done at that time were just not implemented, and how President Zelenskyy himself got elected on the assurance that he would implement those commitments which were there from, and of course he didn't. He went back on that. Forget all of that, but let's come to now to the talks in Alaska. I think that a ceasefire would be a very substantive outcome of this talks, because at the moment I think that the problem is that, you know, like you're saying about the Zelenskyy accusing Russians of attacking Sumy. Now Russia has denied that. They have said we have not attacked Sumy, and on the other hand there are accusations on the Ukrainians attacking something near Kursk, you know,
an oil refinery.
Oil refining. So all those kind of allegations are there. Let's put all those aside. I think that if President Trump is able to bring about a ceasefire, that there will be cessation of hostilities right now, that is the first step to dialogue and diplomacy. And you know, our Prime Minister had said that right from the very beginning, ceasefire followed by dialogue and diplomacy. So I think that it would be a major outcome. The actual negotiations would probably need the presence of Zelenskyy face to face with Putin. And of course, the Europeans want to come in as well. But I think that it should be directly between President Putin and President Zelenskyy, because this is a matter between them, and really getting, you know, people on each side would not help. But if there can be a cessation of hostilities, this would really lay the ground for talks. And yes, you're right about the areas that are in control by the Russians. They were actually incorporated them in their own constitution. So that is also another position, including Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, although the indications are that maybe Zaporizhzhia and Kherson can then be traded off, and Russia gets to keep Donetsk and Luhansk, and the land border, as you said, the land travel from Crimea to Russia. So I think
will the river, with the Dnieper River, then become the natural border, and Zaporizhzhia would be retained in its entirety by the Russians? Clearly, Ukrainians would not want that. You know, when Geeta Mohan and I were reporting from Ground Zero, we reported from Zaporizhzhia, we reported from Kherson, we reported from Kharkiv when the Russian assault was taking place, including the armor assault that had taken place, not just the artillery and rocket assault that had taken place in 2022, and then again in 2023, that entire 1,000-kilometer long battlefield from Kharkiv in the east to Kherson through Zaporizhzhia. But Geeta, right now, realistically, what would be a positive outcome from the Russian point of view and from the American point of view? You know, that baby first step.
I think the conversations where the Russians would be open to conversation about not just ceasefire, which is priority as Trump has spelled out, but also land. What is it that the two sides bilaterally can be talking about? I'm sure the Russian side is going to come with a plan on what they're willing to offer, what's up for offer. Zaporizhzhia certainly is not it has become a non-negotiable in many ways than one, Gaurav, because it holds the nuclear power plant.
Absolutely.
And Putin has always maintained that giving up the nuclear power plant was a huge mistake by Russia. I don't think at this point in time the Russians are ready to give up on the nuclear power plant. So I don't think Zaporizhzhia is going to be on the table. But yes, like you said, a natural boundary with Dnieper as a border between Russia and Ukraine. And if not that, then there could be maybe conversation on Kherson. But there certainly is going to be a bilateral conversation on what Russia has to offer in terms of mineral wealth, in terms of sharing the spoils between the US and Russia. That is going to be a conversation that will certainly be had between the two leaders.
You know, Burzine brought out a very interesting point, Sandeep, and I want to come up to that. The children of conflict, those who were abducted, both sides have talked about combatants being exchanged, prisoners of war being exchanged, but these children, that's one of the most heartbreaking aspects. And again, when I was in Ukraine, this was an issue that repeatedly cropped up. I'll come to you for that, Sandeep. Give me a moment. But what is it that the US president is looking at? I want to just play that out for the benefit of our viewers who've just joined us. Listen in.
I can't tell you that. I don't know. It's there's nothing set in stone. I want certain things. I want to see a ceasefire. This is not to do with Europe. Europe's not telling me what to do. But they're going to be involved in the process, obviously, as will Zelenskyy. But I want to see a ceasefire rapidly. I don't know if it's going to be today, but I'm not going to be happy if it's not today. Everyone said it can't be today, but I'm just saying I want the killing to stop. I'm in this to stop the killing. You know, we're not putting up any money. We're making money. They're buying our weapons, and we're sending them to NATO, and NATO's sending us big, beautiful checks. But that I don't care about that. I care about, it was a big factor when Biden spent $350 billion and got nothing. But what I do care about is they lost last week, 7,011 people were lost, almost all soldiers. 36 people in a town which got hit by a missile. But over 7,000 soldiers. It's crazy.
Sandeep, the word that's coming in from Ukraine, some of their red lines, what they want is an unconditional ceasefire, land, sea, and air. So full spectrum ceasefire, release of prisoners of war, release of all children who've been abducted in war, no restriction on the number of troops that Ukraine would deploy for its protection. Lifting sanctions on Russia should be gradual, and sanctions should be reimposed should any of the agreements be violated. But they will not accept demilitarization. They will not stop procurement of weapons from Europe and America for their own protection. And they do not want to give up fortified territories in the east to protect themselves for future. Don't leave Ukraine out of the solution, out of the final solution. How much of this is Russia likely to cede ground on?
Well, Gaurav, Russia has asked for conditions that will be very difficult for the Ukrainians to swallow. One is, of course, the fact that the territory that they've captured is non-negotiable. They're asking for a demilitarization of Ukraine, and the fact that it never joins NATO, for instance. That's one condition that the Russians are insisting upon. And the fact that if Ukraine were not to be rearmed again, there's very little chance of them being able to survive in a way that they were in the last couple of years. So
Yes.
Russia clearly wants to ensure that Ukraine is not a military threat to them at any point in the near future. As we mentioned earlier, that they don't want a line of control kind of solution. They want this to be a permanent solution, which is why they have been fighting at great cost of men and material. I mean, the Russians are believed to have suffered about 1 million casualties and about 250,000 killed in action. Very large numbers. The Ukrainians are believed to have lost many more.
Yes.
That number. It is the bloodiest war since the
Second World War, absolutely.
21st century, and the bloodiest since the Second World War in Europe. I mean, it is unimaginable, the scale of destruction, the scale of loss.
Burzine, yes, the last 30 seconds that I have on this part of the show, and I want to bring both you and Sushant Sareen in. Burzine, how much of this would Ukraine be willing to accept? Because Russia says no joining NATO, no keeping an armed forces that can be a threat to Russians in future.
Those are Putin's maximalist demands, and you're correct to point out. But Ms. Sikri, why 2004? Let's go back to 1994 and the Budapest Memorandum, when Ukraine voluntarily relinquished its nuclear arsenal, and look where it is today. And as per the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, the West had undergirded security guarantees to it, but clearly it is now out fighting for its very life. So why stop at 2004? You ought to have discussed 1994 in the discussion, which
Sure.
I as a historian have just brought up.
No, but that at the same time, you also need to discuss when America had given this commitment that NATO will not advance east. Why did NATO start advancing east, Sushant Sareen? Because when you're discussing everything should be on the table. Everything should be on the table.
Gaurav, the point is, do you want to end this war or do you want to start a new one? So the point is that you can keep going back in history and talking about what are the kind of things that the NATO did, the Americans did, despite solemn pledges that NATO's expansion further east will not happen. they continue to do a salami slicing approach. And as long as they could push the Russians, they pushed them. And then the Russians suddenly came into their own and started pushing back. So quite clearly, there is that factor which is also at play. But let's come back to what is happening right now. Look, both sides are going to make certain maximalist demands. There will be some demands on which they are not going to back down. So, for example, Ukraine in NATO is a complete no-go area as far as the Russians are concerned. Ceding anything more than the territory that they desperately want, they are not going to do. And of course, they would want certain guarantees that there'll be a kind of neutrality that will be maintained by Ukraine. And like I said, there is a model in Europe, which is Austria, which has happened in the past.
Yes.
So something like that can work out for the Russians. I think the Ukrainians are on a somewhat weaker wicket. Some of their demands completely understandable from their point of view.
Okay.
But given the kind of the field of battle, how much of those will they be able to achieve, and how much of those will conflict with Russia's red lines? So I don't know where the deal is finally going to be struck, but one side will have to give in space, and I don't see the Russians giving in.
Okay, Ambassador Sikri, last 30 seconds, because I want you to stay on with me when I come back from a quick break. But since this point has been raised, you wanted to come in, Ambassador Sikri.
Yeah, I wanted to say very clearly that, we had to also talk about the 2021 agreement between the USA and Ukraine, and that specifically mentions combating, Russia. And in fact, it was this 2021 November agreement which actually was the real signal to Russia to arm and then go in 2022. But coming to the talks in Alaska again, I think that the ceasefire as a first point would be something as an outcome of this summit. Of course, there are conditionalities on each side. The conditionalities of Ukraine not joining NATO, of what help the West Europeans are going to give to Ukraine in terms of weaponry, and the US, what Russia wants in terms of the future of Ukraine. All these conditionalities are there, but they can be talked about, and maybe it'll take a very long time. But in the meanwhile, if there is a ceasefire, if there's an end to hostilities, you will have a complete cessation, which will bring relief to all the people living there. All the killings will stop, all the destruction will stop, and that will itself be such a big force for keeping on with the ceasefire and not going back to hostilities, that the agreement on the various conditionalities will come about.
It's a very interesting point you make. Absolutely. Let there be a ceasefire so that no more lives are lost.